Podcasting from Beijing, this ain't no ordinary show. This is the Chris Rynning Radio Show, covering the Middle Kingdom and beyond. This is your host, investor, author, and China expert, Chris Rynning.
Welcome to the Chris Rynning Radio Show. I'm very happy today to have with me Professor Ketil Arnulf. Welcome to the show, Ketil.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much.
Quick introduction of Ketil. You are the Associate Professor and Associate Dean of BI Fudan MBA program in Shanghai, where you've been based now since 2013. You are also an Associate Professor at BA Handelshøyskolen in Norway, which of course is an internationally leading business and economics university. As a further background and introduction, you have both a master's degree and a PhD in psychology from the University of Oslo. Ketil, I thought we might start a little bit about your upbringing in Norway, where you come from, and eventually if we can make it to how you made it to China.
Yeah. Well, I would say I'm just a normal suburban boy from outside of Oslo, and I just happened to start studying abroad when I was a young man. I went to India as a backpacker. I started studying psychology in Germany and so on. So I always had this idea that knowledge isn't exactly the same thing when you cross the border, when you go somewhere else. Knowledge has a tendency to take on different shapes if you cross borders. That's sort of part of my general interest.
Mm-hmm.
So,
did you start traveling as a teenager, or did you wait sort of until your 20s?
No, I started traveling as a teenager. So, hitchhiking, I went backpacking in India, and, led a life with, sort of a curiosity that took me across borders and around in the world.
And when did you become aware of the Far East and China in particular?
China was actually a late discovery for me. It was coincidental when I started going to BI and had been a business psychologist for some years, and all of a sudden somebody wanted to have somebody who could explain leadership in China. And given the possibility, I volunteered, and that was more or less a coincidence. I never thought actually that I would go to China.
In your psychology studies, what was your relationship to China, if anything, back then?
I always thought about China as a place where the world could be seen. I always had a very deep respect for Chinese history and the long roots of Chinese culture. So I've always been thinking of China as a place that could offer, complementary views on how to organize work and how to, develop an understanding of the forces of nature. So I always thought of China as a slightly different place than where I came from.
Certainly. And today you're the Associate Dean of the BI Fudan MBA program. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that program, because it's such a prominent program here in China.
Well, the program has been in China for 18 years. The first class was launched in 1996, and the program was one of the first foreign management programs to be recognized by the Ministry of Education in China. So the program has a long history, and we now had, I think, more than 2,000 Chinese managers going through the program. It's a huge group of alumni. And it has given us a fabulous insight into their challenges, their need for knowledge, what they need, what they don't need, and so on. So, being here, being a part of that has been an enormous learning experience. You said initially that I've been based here since 2013, which is only partly right, because the first time I came here was in 2006, actually. Mm-hmm. So I've been around more or less since 2006, which is 8 years now. So
yeah,
I guess I've been doing leadership somewhere around 1,500 Chinese managers, I think.
Yeah. And 2006, was that your first time to China, or did you travel here before that?
No, that was actually my first time.
You've seen a fair amount of change in Shanghai as well, then?
Oh, I have. It changes by the day. It does.
But I guess since you arrived permanently in 2013, you've been working on a lot of different research projects. You just recently came up to Beijing and you talked about your most recent research. I was thinking we could hear from you a little bit about that. Sort of give us an introduction on what you're been working on and researching lately.
Yes, this is actually a follow-up on some thoughts I've been having together with some of my Chinese friends and some other Norwegians who've been here for some years, and that has been the idea that the Chinese language and the European languages sort of program our brains differently, and that it has effect on leadership. Part of it is that the Chinese language and the European language has a remarkable flexibility to it. Chinese is extremely high context. It's very brief in the way that it's only used. It's very poetic in the way that things are expressed. An enormous room for both interpretations, but maybe most importantly, it leaves a very important function for relationships. You have to be very mindful about who you're speaking to, about what. Chinese is basically a very relationship-based kind of language.
As opposed to the Indo-European languages, which I think you argue is much more grammatically oriented and much more structured and controlled in its building blocks.
Yes, Indo-European languages in general, and like German, where I used to live in Germany for some years, and I know German fairly well, and Norwegian is a kind of a Germanic language, and we have very rule-based languages. You have to master rules. When you master the rules, the grammar and so on, then you can basically generate a lot of meanings, and these meanings are much less dependent on the situation, much less context-based. On the other hand, in the Indo-European languages, you have a huge freedom to express yourself precisely without offending or hurting or taking really much care of the relationship to the person you're speaking to. So this is a very different way. The whole act of speaking is different.
You gave a few examples up here in Beijing. I'm just curious if you can maybe visualize or repeat some of those examples.
Let's take what Westerners sometimes experience as paradoxical and strange about Chinese is that in Chinese you have very great tolerance for paradoxes. European languages tend to want a specific yes or no to a question. Chinese is remarkably flexible, and the Chinese mind also can live with paradoxes that Westerners will need to resolve. They say, hey, it has to be either this way or that way. So one of my favorite examples is how alcoholic is a bad word in Chinese and in Norwegian and in English, but in China you can market something called the alcoholic's alcohol, the jiu gui jiu, which is doesn't sound strange to Chinese at all. I mean, they can accept an alcoholic's alcohol is good, right? That's a kind of a drunkard spirit, and then it doesn't sound like a good brand in European languages, but to Chinese it works.
Well, the alcoholic would know what alcohol to choose. I guess that's what you mean.
Yeah, it's difficult to explain because it's in Chinese actually the jiu gui jiu sounds a nice thing. In European it sounds like a bad thing, but it gives an interesting example in how paradoxes are embraced in Chinese, whereas Westerners will always try to follow a rule and kind of make it just one way or the other. But what I think is that the rules in China are following more the relationships, because you do what is appropriate within your relationship to your father or to your boss or to your wife. You follow these relationships, and there's not so much the general rules as it's the matter of your obligations to people. But when it comes to understanding the world, the Chinese have an extreme liking for what you say with the proverbs. Chinese is full of proverbs. And the interesting part of the proverb is that it is exactly not what it's about. When Deng Xiaoping was opening the Chinese economy and said, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black and white as long as it catches mice. The whole point is it's not about cats. If you think it's about cats and mice, you really didn't get the point. On the other hand, it's about very serious political and economic issues which are of extreme importance to China. But the Chinese can actually not only accept, but they appreciate the politician who is flexible and who can use language and come up with, great aphorisms and proverbs and how to describe what's right. So that's why, Europeans, they want, explanations and rule-based theories on what works and what does not work. Chinese will see the world more flexible. I think it's fairly obvious you can take any politician from a European country and a pressing political issue. In Norway, we use this example of, one conservative party that wouldn't want to sell much alcohol, and would they really be able to, justify a decision to open more alcohol stores just by, alluding to black and white cats? I doubt it. So, but that also means that European bosses generally need to be speaking, theoretically. They want to have, very kind of explanations, very, square and well-reasoned explanations that can sometimes sound very abstract and unreasonable to Chinese.
Give us a few ideas of how it sort of eases things or hamper things or actually makes it quite difficult to communicate.
Well, take one thing where I think the Chinese are wonderful. They will tell you as a customer, they will value the customer and the customer's relationship very highly. And a Chinese company or a Chinese sales representative may, promise you things that would be, could be slightly exaggerated. You should maybe take it a little bit easier. Is this really going to happen or not going to happen? Who knows? But what they're doing is they're showing a very high degree of goodwill. So to foreigners coming in dealing with Chinese companies, you have to understand that part of this is just an expression of very goodwill, and they're signaling a readiness to interact with you. European companies, Norwegian companies, maybe particularly German companies, could be a lot more fierce and a lot more, sometimes even negative in their contact with customers. If they think that they can't do it, they would say so very bluntly and very explicitly that, this is a deal we can't accept that deal. We cannot deliver on these premises and so on. And a Chinese partner could easily be horrified by this kind of very direct talking. The Chinese would think, well, we can sort it out later. Or just, this isn't what we're talking about is some intentions of cooperation and so on. And we'll say all the correct things in the name of good cooperation and friendship. And then we'll sort it out, the details later on. Very different way of relating to what's said. And you'll find again it in the contract, because then, a German company and a Norwegian company, they will then think of this as elements of a contract. So it should be observed, they should be, you could be held accountable for what you say. And most Westerners experience in China, the contract may not be that important actually, even if the contracts are taking on more importance in a more rule-based Chinese economy, and there is still a tendency to think of relationships as fluid, and your Chinese partner will be thinking of renegotiating and poking it over again and not looking too much at the literal paragraphs of a contract.
So the CFOs or CEOs or chairmen that fly into China expecting to have a meeting and sort of get the lay of the land and get feedback on status or set a budget, they might be not necessarily be misrepresented in the meetings, but language and the communication doesn't exist there in that meeting to get the actual information across. And so how do you break that then? What's the way to deal with this? Is it to spend more time with the Chinese managers, or what kind of cultural bridges can you build?
Well, I think partly the first thing you have to understand dealing in the Chinese business situation is that language is used for ceremonial purposes in the public, So what's said in the public is very often just, formalities and what is acceptable to say and so on. So you have to be aware of that. In the same way, you also have to be aware of that if Europeans are to hold a speech in such a setting in China, people might not, pay that much attention to it. They may look at their mobile phones, talk to each other, or even fall asleep without that being rude. So the way you get your information is, of course, you have to be paying a lot more attention to solidifying your relationships to people on, one-on-one basis. Talk to people one-on-one. Build trust by going out, meeting people, investing in their relationship. And you will get your information by and large. It's absolutely possible. It's just a different way of thinking. When is it appropriate to launch which kind of information? And Westerners will think that this. I think this can even come across sometimes as manipulative to Westerners, but they have to understand that this is the way that information has been flowing in China for a long time. This is the way you have to be listening on different levels, and you have to be very attentive to the context in which you're being told things.
And does it vary, you think, across location in China, sort of west, east, urban, less urban centers, age, education? Or is this a sort of a general phenomenon that, sort of exists across all these different categories, you think?
No, I think you're pointing to something very, very important, and that is, of course, that the global business environment in China is getting more of the day, partly because many companies operate cross-culturally, globally, and we actually have been talking to CEOs and companies who say that they're building industrial cultures, maybe more than the national cultures, which is to be expected, since it's after all the requirements of cooperation that drive these kinds of communication habits. Mm-hmm. But that said, China is still having a huge potential in terms of the people who have not yet taken part in this international exchange. So my experience, if you deal with bilingual people in the finance business in the big metropolis, like Beijing and Shanghai, you may not see the big differences, and you may meet people who think a lot more like yourself than you might think. However, if you're doing dealing with some of the big state-owned companies that are still doing manufacturing and traditional industries, and you're moving onto rural China, then of course you will find habits that are very much more like the traditional ones, and there are still huge groups of people who have not taken part in this modern development. So you have to expect everything.
Yeah, obviously. But this seems to suggest then that Chinese companies and Chinese managers will certainly have an uphill battle going abroad, sort of the outbound investment wave, either, to Europe or US. There's going to be some challenges there then for them.
I think so. We had, when I came here in 2006, we started pretty early then to talk to European companies that were struggling establishing themselves here because they didn't really understand how things work. And now we see the opposite. We see Chinese companies acquiring companies abroad and having really not knowing how to deal with the foreigners and the foreign middle managers once they take over these companies. It's very much the same thing, because the Chinese managers with little experience from international business are not really expecting how rule-based that world out there might be. So and they're just as ethnocentric as we are in a way.
I just had a conversation with a manager at Microsoft, and he sort of gave me a quite interesting analogy. He said that if he went to his team and he said, please copy this, and he gave them a protocol or he gave them a physical product, and they had something to look at, and they would not only copy it fast and cheap, but probably improve on that protocol and make a better product. But if he was telling the team, well, I'd like something that's like this, but not really like this, and, giving them much more of a contextual, visual description, they would struggle. They would not really understand what the task was or how to approach it as a group. His conclusion was that he had to be very specific, he had to be very hands-on with his team, and not leave them really with too much wiggle room in how to interpret a certain task. I don't know sort of how you, if you recognize that analogy or you have some references to it.
That sounds very familiar, because the way that the Chinese language has worked and the way that these authority relationships have worked for a long time is that the people below will wait for specific requests and very specific instructions. Because that's the high context way of doing it, is that you give people very specific instructions, and they're not waiting to interpret or to improve on what you are being thinking. We can see that, I'm not going to go into details here, but we can see that Westerners who learn Chinese are still not really good at understanding what their Chinese co-workers really want, because they need a lot more specific ideas of what their boss is thinking about. Westerners, on the other hand, have a tendency just to take the beginning of a message and try to want to think abstractly about what the boss is thinking about and trying to get the point, kind of the intention. And we can do experiments with people speaking different languages. And we can find that the Chinese participants speaking Chinese will be looking for very specific ideas about what their boss has in mind and wanting very specific and often very concrete cues. Whereas Westerners will play more with general ideas. And just to say that, that sounds maybe sounding good, me being a Westerner, kind of inclined that way. But the point is that Westerners sometimes tend to be too abstract, to have too lofty ideas, and so the Chinese colleagues will look at them and think, what a lot of empty talk. So there are costs and benefits with both traditions in a way.
So does this sort of build up on the stereotype, or maybe it isn't a stereotype, that China and Chinese companies are good at copying, but really to be truly innovative, they have a long way to go? What is your read on that?
I'm skeptical about that, because I think that interpretation is a little bit biased. What I think is true in this is that the Chinese, Chinese learning, the way Chinese learn their, the characters and the language and so on, it has traditionally made Chinese very attentive to copying their masters. That's a very, also they will try not to, if your status is higher, they will try not to improve you too much, because it could be seen as kind of insulting in a way. But I don't think that translates so directly to innovation in business. I mean, a lot of businesses are actually, many of those innovations that people praise so highly are just really slightly improved versions of other products and so on. Innovation in business is not that groundbreaking every time. And I personally think that refinement and little twists to improve business models and products and ways of producing things is a very, very important part of being innovative. So I personally do not feel very confident that Chinese businesses are less innovative than others. But of course, the way that these ideas are exchanged will impact the way that a business is operated. So, I mean, it has impacts. Yeah, but I think what we see is that all leadership styles are like jazz. It's a way of improvising on what you have. And we see today, as you, Chris, frequently point out in your letters and blogs and places, that we have today a lot of Chinese companies that are definitely able to combine the strong sides of the Chinese learning and way of producing and organizing with modern day abstract innovations. I think it's too early to say.
Yeah, well, I'm just going with the words of Steve Jobs. He basically laid it out there that they are copying and stealing as much as they can. And I think if you look at Xiaomi or Lei Jun's company, certainly, you can't look at a Xiaomi phone and think this is an Apple phone. But still, there are aspects of their business model, their strategy, their go-to-market execution, which is very different. And I think we Westerners possibly think of innovation as a very physical thing. It's a product, it's a trademark or an IP or a patent. Whereas in China, in my talks with entrepreneurs here, is as much, processes, is pricing, it's human resources, it's strategy, and those processes are innovation as well. And I think Xiaomi is an example where they've now are a really truly amazing contender to both Samsung and Apple.
I think so. I think what you're pointing to is absolutely right, because innovation, after all, is also how kind of a capability orientation. How can you do what you're good at doing in a way that is going to beat your competition? After all, that was what Steve Jobs did as a Californian. He bought up a lot of inventions from the San Francisco Bay Area. Stuff that he could use because he was in the middle of something that he was greatly inspired by, the dawning of the digital age. And I think what you see in China today is a lot of people, for instance, who suddenly come to grasp with what the online business can do for you. And what we see here in China now comes very soon, the 11th of the 11th, right? The Bachelor's Day.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, it has huge impacts on the consumption patterns, on logistics, on marketing, and so on. So it would be, naive to believe that this is only going to copy what's already out there. That's definitely not what's going to happen.
I guess what's conducive to innovation here as well is that this is the world's largest consumption market for a lot of products and services. And Chinese companies will have the ability to trial and error in that market and build a solid base, even a profit base here before they take on international expansion.
Sure. And you have the whole idea about the business model as a foundation for how you can later on fund your innovations of different kinds. So, I think you're totally right. That's what I also think that the Chinese the Chinese mentality paints a slightly different picture of the world, actually, with less, given units. It's more like a play of forces that interacts. And the Chinese have a very strong sense of how these different forces are moving. That goes for economy, and it goes for markets, and it certainly goes for technologies as well. Mm-hmm. So it is different. It's decidedly different, but it doesn't mean that it is always going to be lagging behind. I don't think that's a very naive thought.
Yeah. All right, Jan Ketil, that's a fascinating view into your work and your research. I want to sort of round it up there. Thank you for your time. You've been very generous with us.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I think I love to be on your show, and I'm really, really happy for all the wonderful attention you've given me here. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
No, thanks, Jan Ketil. And for everyone out there, you can follow Jan Ketil on Twitter at JK Arnulf. I highly recommend that, and I also recommend to follow the BI pages for your publications. I'll also put up Jan Ketil's and BI's contact information on my blog and my website so that you can get in touch with him. So thanks again, Jan Ketil. Thank you for coming on the show, and we speak again soon.
Yes, absolutely. It's an honor.
Thanks for listening to The Chris Rynning Show. For more podcasts or information about China, go to chrisrynning.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Join us next time for another edition of The Chris Rynning Show. The views in this podcast are Chris Rynning's own and are not representative of other legal entities. This podcast does not provide investment advice or recommendations to enter in securities transactions. For more information and disclaimers, go to chrisrynning.com.